The air in the market square was thick with the smells of wet mud, cheap ale, and casual cruelty. It clung to the back of the throat, a miasma of indifference that choked the spirit as surely as a hangman's rope. She stood on a block of splintered wood, a spectacle for the jeering, the bored, and the depraved. Rain, thin and cold as a wraith's touch, slicked her dark hair to her skull and traced chilling paths down the silken shift that was her only garment, a garment chosen to display rather than to clothe. They called her the Jade Cursed, a name born of the intricate, swirling mark that covered the left side of her face, a filigree of pale, opalescent green that crept from her temple down to her jaw. In her homeland, it was a mark of ill omen, a stain upon the soul made manifest on the skin, and it was for this that she had been sold, passed from one callous hand to another until she landed here, in the grimy fist of Baron Valerus's domain. The auctioneer, a man whose face was a ruin of burst veins and false smiles, extolled her exotic virtues with a greasy leer, his words sliding over her like slugs. The crowd laughed. It was all a grand joke, a piece of midday theatre. Then, a silence fell, parting the crowd like a ship's prow through stagnant water. He was a mountain of a man, clad in worn leather and homespun wool, his presence a stark and silent rebuke to the clamor of the town. His face was a landscape of grim history, carved by sun and sorrow, and a thick, dark beard did little to soften the uncompromising line of his jaw. This was Cale, the recluse of Stone Creek Valley, a man who spoke to his beasts more than to people, an outcast by choice. The Baron's men, lounging near the auction block, snickered amongst themselves. This was the true punchline. To sell the foreign curse to the silent brute. A fitting pairing of freaks. Cale's eyes, the color of a winter storm, did not rove over her body as the others had. They met hers, and for a fleeting, impossible second, she saw not avarice or contempt, but a profound and weary stillness. He raised a single hand, 2 fingers extended. The auctioneer, stunned, stammered a price. Cale did not haggle. He dropped a heavy leather pouch onto the auctioneer's table, the clink of coin final and absolute. He had not bought a prize, he had ended a humiliation. The journey to his homestead was a silent pilgrimage through a world of grey mist and dripping pines. The path wound away from the town and into the rugged, untamed foothills that guarded the entrance to his valley, a place the townsfolk spoke of with a mixture of fear and scorn. He walked ahead, his stride long and certain, never once looking back to see if she followed, yet his pace was measured, never so fast that her bare, mud-caked feet could not keep up. The terror that had been a block of ice in her chest began to thaw, replaced by a bewildering and even more frightening uncertainty. He had said nothing, not a single word since the transaction that had made her his property. When the rain intensified, soaking through her thin shift until it was a second, frigid skin, he stopped. Without a word, he unslung the heavy wool cloak from his own shoulders and draped it around hers. It smelled of wood smoke, wet earth, and leather, a scent so fundamentally honest it made her want to weep. The warmth of it was a shock, a kindness so unexpected it felt like a brand. She huddled within its folds, a small, shivering creature dwarfed by the gesture, her eyes fixed on the immense, solid wall of his back as he resumed his trek. The world was a blur of shifting greens and browns, the landscape growing wilder, more primeval, as if they were walking back in time to an age before the cruelty of men had soured the very soil. She watched his hands, calloused and scarred, noting how they never clenched into fists, but rested loosely, ready but not aggressive. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf, yet his every action since claiming her had been one of restraint. She was a thing to be used, a vessel for scorn or lust, she knew this to be the unassailable truth of her existence. Yet this man, this silent giant who had bought her as part of a cruel jest, treated her with a deference that was more unnerving than any threat. As they crested a high ridge, the valley opened up below them, a hidden cradle of impossible green, bisected by a ribbon of silver water. A lone cabin stood beside the creek, a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, a beacon of solitude in the vast wilderness. This was his world. And now, for better or worse, it was hers. The cabin was not a cage. It was small and stark, built of hewn logs and sheer will, but inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on walls adorned with tools, not chains. A thick bearskin rug lay before the fire, and the air held the clean scent of pine and stew. He gestured toward a small room partitioned off from the main one, where a simple cot lay made with clean, rough-spun blankets. It was a space of her own, an acknowledgement of her personhood that struck her more deeply than the cloak. He placed a bowl of hot stew and a chunk of dark bread on the main table, then retreated to the far side of the room to mend a piece of tack, his large frame folded into a chair, his movements deliberate and quiet. He did not watch her eat, granting her the dignity of privacy. The silence was a living thing, a vast, uncharted territory between them. It was not the hostile silence of the auction, nor the fearful silence of her journey, but something else entirely, a silence of waiting, of observation. When she finished the meal that had warmed her to her very core, she set the bowl aside and wrapped the wool cloak tighter around herself, her gaze finally lifting to meet his. His stormy eyes were on her now, their expression unreadable but devoid of the malice she had come to expect from all men. For the first time, he spoke, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. "What is your name?" The question was simple, a basic human inquiry, yet it was a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for years. No one had asked for her name, they had only given her labels: girl, curse, jade skin, property. She swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet room, her own voice a fragile, unused thing. She had to clear her throat before the whisper would emerge, frail as a moth's wing. Elara, the name fell into the silence, and the world seemed to stop. Cale froze. The piece of leather and the awl in his hand stilled completely. His head lifted slowly, and the profound stillness she had seen in the market square returned, but this time it was fractured by something sharp and agonizing. The color drained from his face, leaving the weathered skin pale and taut over the hard bones beneath. His gaze was no longer on her, but through her, looking into a past she could not comprehend. Elara. It was the name of the wind that sang through the pines in high summer. It was the name of the brightest star in the winter sky. And it was the name of his sister, swallowed by the war and the Baron's greed a decade ago, a wound in his soul that had never, ever healed. The days that followed were spun from that same thread of resonant silence, but its texture began to change. The initial quiet, born of her fear and his shock, slowly gave way to a gentle, watchful rhythm. Cale never spoke of his reaction to her name, and she dared not ask. He simply moved through his world with a grave purpose, and she began to find her own place within it. He would rise before the dawn, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire and headed out to tend his small herd of shaggy-haired goats and his singular, stoic horse. Elara, at first, remained in her small room, a ghost in his home, emerging only when he was gone to take the food he left for her. But the enforced idleness chafed at a spirit that, while battered, was not broken. She began to venture out, first only as far as the cabin's porch, then to the neatly tilled garden plot that bordered the creek. She recognized some of the plants from her homeland, hardy herbs for healing and seasoning. Hesitantly, she began to weed, her fingers, long unaccustomed to honest work, finding a strange solace in the rich, dark earth. Cale would return from the pastures and see the small improvements, the rows a little straighter, the encroaching wild vines cleared away, and he would say nothing, but the next morning, a pair of worn but serviceable gardening gloves would be sitting on the porch railing. He communicated in actions, his vocabulary one of quiet provision. One evening, as she sat by the fire, mending a tear in the tunic he had given her, he sat across from her, a block of pale pine in his hands. For hours, his knife moved with an artist's precision, shavings falling like snow onto the floor. When he was done, he held it out to her. It was a small, exquisitely carved bird, its wings half unfurled as if preparing for flight. The detail was so fine she could almost feel the flutter of its wooden feathers. It was an object of pure, unadorned beauty, an offering without expectation. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines, her throat tight with an emotion she could not name. She looked at her reflection in the small, polished metal plate he used for shaving and saw the jade mark on her face. For the first time, she did not see a curse. In the firelight, the pale green swirl seemed less like a stain and more like the intricate patterns on a river stone or the delicate veining of a leaf. The fragile peace of their valley was shattered by the arrival of iron-shod horses and the grating laughter of cruel men. Two of Baron Valerous's tax collectors, their leather jerkins emblazoned with his crest of a snarling wolf, rode into the clearing as if they owned it. They were the casual tendrils of the Baron's power, sent to probe the margins of his domain and squeeze them for whatever they were worth. They dismounted with an arrogant swagger, their eyes cataloguing Cale's small homestead with undisguised contempt. Well, the leader, a man with a scarred lip, sneered. The beast of Stone Creek. The Baron sends his regards. And his bill he held out a scroll, the wax seal a bloody smear of red. Cale emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, his face an impassive mask, but a dangerous stillness had settled over his massive frame. It was the stillness of a mountain before an avalanche. He took the scroll, his eyes scanning the exorbitant demands. It was not a tax, it was a punishment, a deliberate effort to ruin him. Then, the collectors saw Ilara, who had frozen in the doorway of the cabin, the carved bird clutched in her hand. The second man let out a low whistle. Look what we have here. The little jade doll. Heard you bought the Baron's leftover joke. The scarred man's eyes glittered with a possessive, greedy light. She's looking healthier than she did on the block. The Baron might want his property back, recluse. Especially now that you've fattened her up. The insult hung in the air, thick and vile. Ilara flinched as if struck. But Cale did not rise to the bait. He did not shout or draw a weapon. He simply folded the scroll with meticulous care and looked at the man, his storm-colored eyes holding a cold, flat emptiness that was more terrifying than any rage. There is nothing for you here, he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying the weight of finality. This is my land. She is under my protection. The scarred man laughed, reaching for the hilt of his sword. Protection? Your protection ends when the Baron says it does. Cale took one slow step forward. He did not rush, he did not threaten. But in that single step was the promise of a violence so absolute and efficient that the collector's bravado evaporated like mist in the sun. They saw not a farmer, but something they recognized from the darkest corners of the battlefield, a man who had perfected the art of ending things. They exchanged a nervous glance, their bluster deflating. You'll regret this, outcast, the leader spat, backing toward his horse. The Baron will hear of this defiance. They mounted hastily and galloped away, leaving a bruised silence in their wake. Cale stood unmoving for a long moment, his back to Ilara, his shoulders set like granite. In that moment, she understood that his solitude was not just a preference, it was a quarantine. He was protecting the world from himself as much as he was protecting his valley from the world. Word of Cale's defiance, though meant as a threat, acted as a spark in the tinder of the dispossessed. Whispers traveled through the downtrodden communities bordering the Baron's lands, whispers of a place where the Baron's reach was not absolute, a valley defended by a silent giant. The first to arrive was a family of 3, a farmer named Jorund, his wife Anya, and their young son, Finn. The Baron had seized their land for failing to pay a punitive tax, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They appeared at the edge of the clearing one evening, wraiths of exhaustion and despair, expecting to be turned away. Instead, Cale met them, listened to Jorund's halting story with that unnerving stillness, and then simply gestured toward a fallow field further down the creek. There is land. You can work it. Ilara brought them warm stew and blankets, her own recent past a raw, empathetic wound. She saw her own terror mirrored in Anya's eyes and found herself offering reassurance, her voice gaining a strength she hadn't known it possessed. Soon, others followed. A weaver whose loom had been broken by the Baron's enforcers. A young scholar who had been exiled for owning a forbidden book. A grizzled hunter who refused to give the Baron's court the majority of his kills. They were a collection of broken pieces, the human refuse of a tyrant's reign. Cale's valley became a sanctuary, not by grand design, but by a simple, shared need. He did not rule them, he merely gave them the space to exist. It was Ilara who began to weave them together. Her quiet, observant nature saw the needs and the talents of each newcomer. She organized the expansion of the garden, her knowledge of herbs and planting cycles far exceeding anyone else's. She showed Anya how to make salves for burns and teas for fevers. She listened to the scholar's quiet recitation of poetry and history, her mind a thirsty sponge. The community built new, simple dwellings, their hammers echoing in the valley, a sound of construction, not destruction. They began to look to her, not just as the recluse's strange companion, but as the heart of their nascent community. The jade mark on her face, once a symbol of her isolation, became something else entirely. Little Finn, who had at first been afraid of it, now traced its patterns with his finger, asking her to tell him stories of the star map on her skin. She had no stories, so she began to invent them, tales of constellations and heroes from a homeland she barely remembered, her voice growing more confident with each telling. She was no longer Ilara the Cursed. She was becoming Ilara, the storyteller, the healer, the heart of the found. The growing settlement in Stone Creek Valley did not go unnoticed. To Baron Valerus, it was not a community of refugees, it was an infestation of vermin, a blight on lands he considered his own, and a direct challenge to his authority. The report from his tax collectors, colored by their humiliation, spoke of a fortress being built, of an army being gathered by the silent outcast Kale. Pride, the most dangerous and fragile of a tyrant's assets, was wounded. He would not tolerate this pocket of defiance. He dispatched his captain, a man named Malric, whose cruelty was matched only by his efficiency. With him rode 20 men-at-arms, not collectors this time, but soldiers, their chainmail and steel helms glinting with malicious promise. Their orders were simple: burn the settlement, salt the earth, and bring back the heads of the outcasts, especially the silent giant and his jade-marked pet. The hunter, scouting in the foothills, brought the news. Panic rippled through the small community. They were farmers and craftsmen, not warriors. They looked to Kale, their fear a palpable thing. He gathered them in the main clearing as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky. His face was grim, but his eyes held no trace of fear, only a cold, hard resolve. The time for hiding was over. The warrior he had buried long ago had to be resurrected. "They will come at dawn," he stated, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. "They will show no mercy. We can flee into the mountains and be hunted down, or we can make our stand here. In our home." The desperate murmur went through the crowd. Jorand, the farmer, stepped forward, his face pale. "But how can we fight them? We have nothing but farm tools." Kale's gaze swept over them. "You have more than you know. You have the land. You have each other. And you will have me." That night, the valley transformed into a frantic hive of preparation. Under Kale's curt, precise instructions, they began to turn the valley into a death trap. Pits were dug and hidden with brush. Ropes were strung between trees to trip horses. The creek was partially dammed upstream to create a surge of water that could be released at a key moment. Kale moved among them, a master of a brutal, forgotten craft. He showed Jorand how to brace a sharpened hoe like a spear, the weaver how to fletch crude but effective arrows, the scholar where to place caltrops. He was no longer just a protector, he was a commander, his every word and gesture honed by a past he never spoke of. Ilara, watching him, saw the terrible cost of his knowledge etched on his face. But she did not cower. Her own role became clear. She took the women and children, not to hide them, but to organize them. Drawing on her knowledge of plants, she directed them to gather pollen from a specific mountain flower, a potent irritant that, when thrown into a fire, would create a thick, blinding smoke. She prepared bandages and poultices, turning her small herb garden into a triage station. She was the logistician, the healer, the calm center of their desperate storm, her transformation from victim to leader now complete. The attack came with the first grey light of dawn, a wave of dark metal and grim intent crashing against the valley's edge. Malric, confident in his numbers and superior arms, led the charge directly down the main path. The valley's defenses, crude as they were, worked with surprising efficiency. The first riders screamed as their horses stumbled into hidden pits. Ropes pulled taut, unseating soldiers who were quickly set upon by farmers wielding tools with desperate fury. Kale was a force of nature, a whirlwind of controlled destruction. He fought not with the wild rage of a berserker, but with the cold, economic lethality of a master swordsman. His long sword, once used only to clear brush, became an extension of his will, each parry, thrust, and slash a final, deadly sentence. He moved through the chaos, shoring up their makeshift line, his presence a bulwark against the tide of steel. But the Baron's men were professionals. They regrouped, their discipline overriding their initial shock, and began to press forward, their greater numbers and skill starting to tell. Joran fell, a sword wound in his side, and the line began to buckle. It was then that Ilara acted. From her position on the high ground near the cabin, she gave a sharp cry. On her signal, Anya and the other women hurled the sacks of pollen onto the bonfires they had prepared. A thick, acrid yellow smoke billowed down the slope, enveloping the attackers. They choked and coughed, their eyes streaming, their organized advance dissolving into a confused melee. Into this chaos, Kale led a renewed charge. The dispossessed, heartened by the sudden advantage, fought with the strength of those defending their entire world. The tide of the battle turned. Malric, enraged, cut his way through the smoke, his eyes fixed on Kale, recognizing the source of this impossible resistance. He bellowed a challenge, and the two men met in the center of the clearing, the battle swirling around them. It was a clash of brute force against disciplined skill. Malric was strong and relentless, but Kale was patient, his defense impenetrable, waiting for the one mistake that would end it. As they fought, Ilara moved from the ridge, not to hide, but to command. Her voice, clear and steady, rang out across the clearing, directing the defenders, pointing out flanking maneuvers, her tactical mind, sharpened by the scholar's books and her own innate intelligence, seeing the whole battlefield. She was no longer a jade-cursed girl. She was a queen defending her people. The duel was brutal. Malric's broadsword crashed against Kale's long sword, sparks flying in the smoky air. The captain fought with the arrogance of a man who had never known true defeat, while Kale fought with the grim determination of a man who had nothing left to lose but this last, precious sanctuary. Around them, the battle raged, but this single combat was its heart. The Baron's men, seeing their captain locked in a struggle, hesitated, their momentum broken. The settlers, seeing Kale as an avatar of their defiance, pushed forward with renewed vigor. Malric, growing desperate, overextended with a wild swing. It was the opening Kale had been waiting for. He deflected the blow, stepped inside the captain's guard, and with a movement too fast to follow, disarmed him. The broadsword clattered to the ground. Malric stood panting, defenseless, his face a mask of disbelief. Kale's sword point rested lightly on the man's throat. The fighting around them stuttered to a halt. All eyes were on the two figures in the clearing. This was the moment of decision. But Kale did not deliver the final blow. He held his position, his breathing steady, his eyes cold as ice. At that moment, Ilara walked out of the smoke, her head held high, the jade mark on her face seeming to catch the morning light. She stopped beside Kale, her presence a profound statement. She was not his property to be fought over, she was his equal, standing with him at the moment of victory. She looked directly at Malric, and then her gaze swept over the remaining soldiers. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried an authority that cut through the tension. "Look at us," she said, her voice clear and without a tremor. "We are the farmers whose lands you seized. The craftsmen whose tools you broke. The families you cast out. We are what your baron tried to throw away. But we are not refuse. We are people. And this is our home." She pointed a slender finger at the captain. "He fights for a tyrant's greed. We fight for the right to exist. Go back to your master. Tell him his power ends at the edge of this valley. Tell him the people he discarded have found their strength." Her words, simple and earnest, struck a chord with the soldiers. They were common men, conscripts who served the baron out of fear, not loyalty. They looked at the determined faces of the settlers, at the body of Joran being carried away by his weeping wife, and their resolve crumbled. They had come to crush vermin, but they had found a community of people willing to die for their small patch of earth. Malric, seeing the mutiny in his men's eyes, spat on the ground. "This isn't over." Kale's sword pressed a fraction deeper. Here, Kale's voice rumbled, it is he knocked the captain unconscious with the flat of his blade and then looked to the remaining soldiers. "Take him and go. Do not return silently." The soldiers obeyed, gathering their wounded and their disgraced captain, and retreated from the valley, leaving behind a hard-won, blood-soaked peace. In the aftermath of the battle, a profound quiet settled over the valley, broken only by the sounds of mourning and mending. They buried their dead, including the farmer Jorund, on a hillside overlooking the fields he had hoped to cultivate. The victory felt less like a triumph and more like a grim affirmation of their right to suffer and survive on their own terms. The community, forged in shared desperation, was now tempered by shared sacrifice. They rebuilt what was broken, tended to their wounded, and began the slow, arduous process of turning their sanctuary into a true home, a fortified haven against the world outside. Cale and Elara moved through it all, the twin poles of their new world. He was the silent shield, the physical embodiment of their security, while she was the cohesive force, the voice of their collective heart. The unspoken bond between them had deepened, transformed from a protector's duty and a victim's gratitude into a partnership of profound and mutual respect. Weeks turned into a season. The harvest came, a bounty rested from the valley's rich soil, and a great fire was lit in the clearing to celebrate. The scholar read from his salvaged books, the weaver presented new blankets dyed with pigments from berries Elara had found, and Finn, Jorund's son, played a simple, haunting melody on a wooden flute Cale had carved for him. Laughter, a sound long absent from many of their lives, echoed against the valley walls. Later that night, when the celebrations had quieted and the settlers had returned to their homes, Cale and Elara